Alright, here's a quick reference to the code that we're going to be using in this tutorial. So in our previous tutorial, we put in this line of code, and this right here to get either a 0 or a 1, depending on whether or not we are holding down the trigger. So then we want to shoot a ball. So we need a reference to the ball or the bullet prefab. We need to know where we're going to spawn it, and then the number of seconds in between the shots, and then we are going to keep track of the number of seconds until we are allowed to shoot again. So inside of the update loop, we are checking to see if we are pressing the trigger, and if track shoot, the number of seconds until we're allowed to take another shot, has reached 0 or is smaller than 0, then we are going to shoot a bullet. So here we are going to instantiate, or that's just a fancy word for spawn or create, and we're creating a bullet prefab. And we're going to create it at the spawn point dot position and spawn point dot rotation. Spawn point is just an empty game object that we're going to stick to the tip of the gun in Unity. And then we are going to reset the timer until we're allowed to shoot again. And then outside of that, so just all the time, we are going to have track shoot, the timer that we created, always count down at a rate of 1 per second. So if it is larger than 0, it's going to keep counting down, and then even if it gets below 0, it's going to keep counting down, and we're just checking to see if it's smaller than or equal to 0. So yeah, that's the code in a nutshell. So now on to the rest of the tutorial. Oh, and I forgot to mention, here's the bullet script. So we just get the rigid body component inside of void start, and then we add force to that rigid body, transform.forward, and then we multiply that by a variable that we can adjust called shoot force. And then we have a timer that counts down from 10 or whatever number we set it to, and when that timer reaches 0, it destroys itself. So that's the bullet script. Hey everyone, welcome to the Master Indie Tutorial channel. My name's Erica, and today we're going to be learning how to make a gun that shoots in VR, which sounds really simple, but we can actually break this down into a ton of different steps. So anytime you're trying to figure out how to do something in Unity and where to even begin, it really helps to take the idea of what you want to do and break it down into as many tiny steps as possible. So in this example, we want to shoot a gun, but we need to start asking some questions like, what do we want the gun to shoot? And maybe in a later tutorial, we'll actually make the bullet move instantly, at the speed of a bullet towards the target. But for now, let's do something a little bit more interactive and physics, because physics is really fun in VR. So we're going to just add a rigid body, and we're going to shoot some balls that can just fly forward and knock into some stuff. So even that's like 2 steps. We need a ball that's going to have physics and collisions, and then we need it to shoot forward. Then we also need to ask, when are we going to create a ball? And the answer to that is pretty simple. Whenever we pull the trigger. We learned how to get input from the trigger in the previous episode. So we will spawn a bullet, and we need to ask questions like, where do we want to spawn the bullet? So what we're going to do is we're going to create an empty game object that's going to stick to the front of the gun and hover and move with it. And it's going to be like an invisible target that we can always reference and be like, this is the spot where we want to spawn the bullet. So now we know where we want to spawn the bullet, and we know that as soon as it spawns, we want to shoot it forward. And then after a while, there's going to be a ton of bullets just rolling around in the scene. So we need to create a timer that's going to delete them after a certain amount of time. So there's probably even more things that we can think about and add to this bullet. I'm just trying to think of it as simple as possible, but even keeping it as simple as possible, there's still so many different things we can add to this bullet. So that is my big tip for this episode, is just really take the idea of what you want to make and break it down into as many small steps as you can possibly think of. And before we start the tutorial, of course, I gotta say, if you haven't already, please check out Jet Island. It's available right now on Steam, and it is a crazy open world game with hoverboards and hook shots and giant boss fights. It really takes open world physics and takes it to a whole new level. And if you like motion in VR, you're really going to love this game. So I'd love it if you go check it out. All right, let's get started with this tutorial. Alright, let's learn how to make a gun in VR that shoots some rigid body spheres. So in our last tutorial, we set up VR in Unity and got input from the trigger. So real quick before I get into anything, I'm just going to make a world that actually looks like something. So I'm going to click on the plus, and I'm going to first start with making a ground. And let's center that at 0, 0, 0, so that it's all centered up with the floor. Also, make sure your XR origin is also set to position 0, 0, 0. All right, so now we have a ground. Also make sure that it has a collider. It should have one by default. And now let's create some cubes that we can shoot our spheres against. So let's create a 3D object cube, and let's move that over, and let's move that just above the ground, just like that. And let's actually make this something that will collide and react physically when we shoot it with these balls. So we're going to click on component down here and just start typing in rigid body and add a rigid body component. And I'm going to have the spheres be a little bit heavier and the cubes be a little bit lighter so that they knock backwards a little bit more dramatically. So let's set the mass to about 0.5, and now that should be good. And let's go ahead and duplicate these so that we have a couple of them. And it'll make our level just slightly more interesting while we're working on it and, you know, have something to actually interact with. All right, so that looks pretty good. I think that is our level all set up. Also, with your XR origin, you might want to play it and just double check to make sure the camera isn't in the ground. You can try messing with this. I find that not specified works, but you can also set it to floor. So mess with that, and you can also, if you really need to, just move the whole thing up and down if you find yourself just being inside of the ground. All right, so the first step to actually being able to shoot balls when we pull the trigger is to know when we are pressing the trigger. And we have that first step all done from our last tutorial. So here's the code, and here is the line of code specifically that gives us either a 0 or 1 when we're pressing the trigger. So instead of being inside of a debug.log so that it displays it in the console, let's put this inside of an if statement. So let's delete all of the debug.log stuff. So that is the 0 or the 1. So let's just write if, and now we need to put all of that inside of parentheses. And right now it's basically asking if this number, and that's not really a question. We want to ask if this number equals something. And when you're inside of an if statement, you write 2 equal signs like that to ask it whether or not it is equal to something. And we're just going to write the number 1, and we want to see if it is equal to the number 1. And if that is the case, we can either write a line of code. Whoops, I didn't mean to write that. I just meant to write random letters. It will either run just this one line of code, or if we want to run multiple lines of code, we can do squiggly brackets just like that. And then if you do // then you can write anything you want. This is just a comment to yourself. So we'll say shoot ball, and that will be a reminder to ourselves, this is where we're going to write the line of code that's going to shoot the ball. So that's not going to actually do anything yet. So let's actually make a ball that can be shot. So yeah, next, let's go back to Unity. All right, so now real quick, let's first actually make the ball that is going to be shot. So let's click on this little plus, create 3D object, sphere, and this is a pretty big sphere, so I'm going to scale it down. How about 0.2, whoops, 0.2, 0.2? Whoops, I accidentally put caps lock on. Yeah, that seems like a pretty decent size. And we also want this to have a rigid body. So we're going to click on Add Component Rigid Body. And now we're going to have something that it's going to fall to the floor and interact with physics for right now. We're going to add a line of code that's going to make it shoot forward, but right now if we run the game, it's just going to fall down to the ground. And one other thing I want to add before we go forward is where it says here, collision detection discrete. Let's make that continuous, just so that the collisions are a little bit more accurate and the ball is less likely to fall through the floor, because that's going to be a little bit of a problem, but not a major issue if you miss that step. All right, so now we have our sphere, and let's rename this to bullet, just so that we know that not only is it a sphere, but it's going to be a bullet. And now let's create a script for the bullet. So let's right-click inside of the My Assets folder, create C# script, and let's call this bullet script, and let's open that up. Okay, so the main thing that we want the ball to do as soon as it's created is to shoot forward. And that's about it. Later we're going to add a timer so it deletes itself after a certain amount of time, but at first we just wanted to shoot forward. So we need a couple things to do that. We need to know how much force to make it shoot forward. We need a reference to the rigid body so we know what rigid body to add the force to. And I think that's actually about it. So let's first make a public float. And remember, a float is just a number that can have a decimal place. And public means that we can see it in the inspector. And let's call this shoot force. And then we could add a semicolon and it will by default be 0. Or we can have it equal something by default. So let's have it by default equal 100, then semicolon. And we can adjust this in the inspector afterwards to find exactly the right number that feels like the right amount of force. So now we need a variable that's going to remember the rigid body so we know what to add force to. And we don't actually need this in the inspector. We could put it in the inspector, but I prefer to just make it all be automatic and be handled by the code. So we're just going to write rigid body just like that. So it's going to be a variable that's going to remember a rigid body. And the rigid body we're going to remember is the one that is attached to this bullet. So let's just call it rigid body, but it's going to be lowercase instead of capital so that we remember if we write it in lowercase, it's the variable. And if we write it in uppercase, that's the type of variable. Okay, so now inside of void start, everything that happens in here is going to happen either at the very start of the game, at the very start of the level, or just whenever this game object is created. So in this case, it's going to be when the bullet is created. So the first thing, we want to get a reference to the rigid body. So let's do rigid body equals get component. And the type of component we want to get is rigid body, and then opening and closing parentheses and semicolon. So that is going to get the rigid body component that's going to be attached to the game object that this script is attached to. So basically now every time going forward after this, anytime we write rigid body, it's going to remember this here, that particular rigid body. We can also get references to rigid bodies on other game objects if we want to, but in this case, we don't need that. So we do want to write one more line of code in the very start, and that's going to be to add force to the bullet. So we're going to write rigid body dot add force, and then the force that we want to add is going to be in the forward direction. So in order to get any kind of position or rotation of our game object in 3D space, we need the transform components. And if I go back to Unity real quick just to show you, so if I click on the bullet, this right here is the transform component. Every game object has a transform component, and we have the position, rotation, and scale. So we can get all of that information from the transform component. So in this case, normally you have to do this whole thing about creating a variable and getting the components for something like a rigid body or any other type of component, but transform is just automatically available. So we can skip that step for transform. So all we need to write is transform. And now the information we want to ask of this transform is what direction is forward for this game object. So all we have to do is write dot forward, and that's going to give us an XYZ that represents a direction of which way we're facing. So if the bullet is looking down the z-axis, it would give us 0, 0, 1. If the bullet is looking straight up in the air, it would give us 0, 1, 0. So yeah, that is going to give us the forward direction, but it's only going to have a magnitude of 1, or like a length of 1. So if we're adding force, it's only going to add 1 force. And we want to add 100 force, or maybe even more. So we want to add whatever we assign the number in shoot force. So to do that, all we have to do is multiply it by, whoops, I can't type, shoot force, just like that. And then that is everything we need, and we can just write a semicolon, and now that should be able to make the bullet, or this sphere rigid body, shoot forward. So now we need to know where to spawn the bullet, when to spawn the bullet, and what direction to make the bullet face when it is being spawned. So we're going to go to our VR player script. It might be more accurate to rename this to gun script. Just remember, if you rename the script, you also have to rename it right there. Otherwise, you'll get an error. But I'm going to go ahead and just leave it for now. So we're going to need a few more variables. So we're going to want, first of all, the bullet itself. So game object bullet prefab. And prefab basically just means a game object that we save in the project folder so that then we can make copies of it later. So that's what we're going to be doing with this bullet. We can also make copies of any game object that we want. So we're making a public variable so we can see it in the inspector, and it's going to be of type game object. So if I go back to Unity, so it's not just going to be one of these components, but it's going to be everything, the entire game object itself. So that's what we're referencing. So we have the bullet itself, and now we want to know where we're going to spawn the bullet. So let's make a public variable, and let's make this one of type transform. We could make this a game object, because what we're going to do is we're going to create an empty game object that's just going to float in front of the tip of the gun. And that is going to tell us, we're just going to copy the position of that game object and spawn the bullet right there. So we could do game object and then get game object.transform to get the position and rotation of that bullet spawn point game object. But instead, we could just save just the transform itself and save us a step. So let's call this spawn point, just like that. And we're going to do some dragging and dropping and assign these manually in the inspector. So that's pretty good. Next, we need how many bullets per second we're going to shoot. So that's going to be a float. So that's a number with a decimal place. And let's call this shoot per second, just like that. And let's give that a default, how about 4 shoots per second. And now we need a number that's going to count and keep track of these shoots per second. So we don't need to edit this in the inspector. It's just going to be handled by the code, and it's going to just count in the background for us. So we're just going to skip the public and just write float, and we're going to call this track shoot per second. And we can go ahead and just write semicolon because it's going to have a default value of 0. We're going to have this number just keep on counting down to 0, and every time it reaches 0, it's going to say that we're ready to shoot, and then we shoot, and then we're going to set that number up. Actually, instead of shoot per second, let's say seconds between shoot. Yeah, let's rename that to seconds between shoot, and that's going to and we'll just call that track shoot. That's just going to simplify things for us. So instead of seconds between shoot, instead of 4, let's have that be, I don't know, 0.2, 0.2. But we're getting a little error. Just a little tip: whenever you write a a number that's something point a decimal place, you need to put, you need to put a little F after it. That's just the way you need to write things in C#. So yeah, I think those are all of the variables that we need. So first, let's, in here, write the line of code that's going to spawn a bullet. So you would think that you would write spawn like that, but actually it's called instantiate. Kind of just like a weird sounding word. I wish it was a little bit more video game sounding, like just, something simple like create or spawn or something like that. But the word they use is instantiate. It just means spawn. And now in the parentheses, we need to give it the game object that we want to create a copy of, and then the position, and then the rotation. So the game object we want to create a copy of is easy. It's just this up here, bullet prefab. So we're going to type that, bullet prefab, and then we write comma space. And now we want to give it the position. So we're going to do spawn point dot position, and then we want to give it the rotation. So we do spawn point dot rotation, and now we have given that all of the information that it needs to create this bullet. So technically we could save this and then, drag and drop the game objects in Unity and set this all up and ready to go with this code. But the problem is that void update, this is every single frame. So if your game is running at like 120 frames per second, this is going to spawn 120 bullets per second every time we pull the trigger. So that's not exactly what we want. We want to slow it down a little bit and be able to control how often we shoot. So inside of here, we're going to ask one more question. So instead of just asking if we're pulling the trigger, we're going to say if we're pulling the trigger, and, so you write the and symbol twice to ask it another question. And the question we're going to ask it is if track shoot is smaller than or equal to 0. And we're going to have this number count down. So what we're going to do is when we shoot a bullet, we're going to, first of all, shoot the bullet, but then we're going to also have track shoot equal, and then we're going to set it to seconds between shoot, and that will reset the timer. And now outside of this if statement, just all the time, we want to have track shoot start counting down. So we are going to, we can say equal track shoot minus, and then count down 1 per second. Or you can do minus equal, and it will just minus from what it currently is. So we're going to say track shoot minus equal time dot delta time. And time dot delta time it's a very tiny number that gets smaller and smaller depending on what your frame rate is. But basically, it's always going to give you 1 per second. So if you have this add up over time, it'll take 1 second for all of those numbers to add up and to equal 1. So basically, this just means per second. So we're going to have this count down the seconds until when we are allowed to shoot again. So now that is all the code that we need to shoot, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like just slow it down. So yeah, I think that is all of the code. Well, not quite. There's one other little thing. And since we just did time.delta time, let's do one more. Let's make a public float time to destroy. And this is going to be the number of seconds that the bullet is going to exist for. And then at the end of this timer, we're going to have it destroy itself or delete itself. So let's have them stick around for, how about 10 seconds? And now inside of void update, so this is every frame, we're going to do time to destroy minus equal time dot delta time. So this is just going to keep counting down forever and forever. So since it's starting at 10, it's going to take 10 seconds for it to reach 0. Whoops. And then we're going to write an if statement that says if time to destroy is smaller than or equal to 0, then destroy game object. Just like that. And we can write game object just like we can write transform, and that's going to reference the game object that this script is attached to. And when we destroy that, basically that's the bullet destroying itself or deleting itself. So that should be everything we need to make the bullet delete itself after a certain amount of time. All right, I think that is all of the code that we need. So now let's actually make this bullet actually become a prefab. And to do that, all we gotta do is drag and drop it into our My Assets folder. And now this is a prefab. And actually, whoops, I forgot to do one thing. So let's delete it here in our scene. And now I'm going to select it in the project. And then I almost forgot to add component bullet script. And we need the bullet script so it can actually do all of these things. So we'll probably need to adjust this here and change it later to a higher number. But let's go ahead and just leave that for now. Now we're going to need a gun script. Well, actually, I forgot we called it the VR player script, and it's already right here. It's just going to need the bullet prefab, which we can drag and drop it there, and it needs a spawn point transform. So we need to create that. So let's double click and zoom in on the right controller, and let's create some cubes just to make it look like a gun real quick. But we don't want this cube to collide with anything, so let's right click and remove the box collider component, and also remember to drag and drop that onto the right controller so that it sticks and moves with the right controller. So now let's grab that and size it down until it's about the size of the handle of a gun, and then let's press Control D, and let's move it over here, and let's rotate it about 90 degrees. It doesn't really have to be perfect. You can take your time and actually make this look better than what I'm doing right now. And now let's click on plus, create empty, and let's call this spawn point. And let's drag and drop that also onto the right controller, and let's also move it. Whoops. Trying to zoom in and center on it. We want to make sure that's centered right on the tip of the gun, and you also want to make sure that it's set to pivot and local up here, and make sure that that blue arrow is pointing forward in the direction of our gun. So now we have that. So let's go back to our player script, and where it says spawn point, we're going to drag and drop the spawn point just like that. And I am pretty sure that is everything that we need. Oh, wait, actually, right here is the center of the controller, isn't it? Yeah, I think all that stuff is too far forward. Let's drag that back a little bit. Yeah, there we go. You might need to run the game and test to see like where the controller is going to end up. One other thing, this is totally optional. I am going to add a camera, and I'm going to drag and drop that onto the main camera and set the position to 0, 0, 0. Also make sure the rotation is 0, 0, 0. And then where it says target eye, I'm going to say none, main display, and I'm going to set the field of view to more like 100. And I'm only doing that so that you can actually see what's going on, because with VR, the default camera is really zoomed in and you're not going to be able to see what I'm doing. So that's totally optional. I'm just doing that to make it look better in this tutorial. So yeah, I think that is everything we need. Let me turn on my controllers. And come on, connect. There we go. All right, so I have SteamVR running in the background, and I'm going to go ahead and run the game, and we're going to see if this works. All right, so as you can see, the gun is way off, way far away from my hand, so let me fix that real quick. All right, here we go. I found the problem. When you click on right controller, it will highlight where the center of that controller is. I assumed it was down on the floor, but it's actually up here. So I just dragged the gun, these three pieces here. I selected all of them, and I just moved them up until it looked like it was lined up pretty good. So now let's run the game and see how that looks. All right, that looks pretty good, and I pull the trigger, and there are some balls, and they are not moving very fast, so let's adjust that to a higher number. So let's click on the bullet, scroll down to the bullet script, and shoot force. Let's set that to more, I don't know, how about 1,000? Make it quite a bit stronger. There we go. Okay. Whoops. All right, so now when I shoot these cubes, it really has a lot of force to it, and every time I pull the trigger, also I can hold it down. I forgot that that was the whole point of the script. I was just pulling it one at a time, but if I hold it down, it actually shoots it at a rate of, what was that, 5 bullets per second, or 0.2 seconds in between every shot. And let's shoot those up in the air, and let's watch them for a second. Actually, 10 seconds is quite a bit of time. I'm just waiting to see if any of them delete. Alright, so I'm going to go to this time to destroy and set that to 1 second temporarily and see if that part of the code is actually working correctly. So let's just shoot one at the ground, and it deleted itself. Okay, so it is working. So you can see they start deleting themselves in the air. So yeah, that is everything how to shoot rigid body spheres out of a gun. It is actually kind of fun. You could do a little bit of level design, and now I just knocked away all the cubes, but you could build up the cubes and make something more interesting so that you can shoot and destroy it. We can also, in the future, do more fun things like make guns that you can actually pick up, make a shoot particle at the tip of the gun, like a muzzle flare. We can make it make sounds when it collides with something. We could put health bars on the cubes and have the bullets actually lower the health, and then they'll destroy themselves after that health has been lowered. So we can just keep on building and building and making this more complicated and making it into a real game. But yeah, for now, that was the tutorial. Alright, I hope you found that video helpful. You can check out my Patreon in the description if I do eventually decide to do that. I'm still kind of deciding. And also, please check out my main channel where I am creating a VR game that's going to be kind of like Jet Island, but a little bit more advanced and realistic, and it's going to have really realistic photogrammetry graphics and way more dark and serious, and I'm really looking forward to that game, even though it is taking forever to make it. And be sure to, help me out with the YouTube algorithm and all that good stuff, because I am starting this channel from scratch and it's going to take a little while to build it up. So any help would be appreciated. So until my next episode, I will see you later and keep making games.